In the last video, we defined the terms domain, codomain, and range with respect to functions. In this video, we're going to look at those concepts a little bit more closely. In particular, we're going to look at an example function and find the domain, some possibilities for the codomain, and the range of that function to show you how that works. So the function that we're going to look at is the square root function. So if the input is a number x, the output is going to be the square root of that number x. So if we're looking at the domain, remember the domain means we're looking at the units that are appropriate for this function. And what appropriate means is that the inputs that we can put in there and get a meaningful output. So one thing that is helpful to do in finding the domain of a function is to find inputs that aren't appropriate, that are inappropriate, and sort of weed those out and see whatever's left. And if you look at the square root function, what we're going to have problems with is if we're trying to take the square root of a negative number. You simply can't do that with real numbers, and so the domain cannot include any negative numbers. However, if you put in any sort of random non-negative number, you can take the square root of that number, which means you get an output anytime you put an input of a non-negative number, and that tells us that the domain does include all non-negative numbers. So it does not include any negative numbers, it includes all non-negative numbers, which means that the domain is the set of all non-negative real numbers. Alright, so for codomain, remember the deal with codomain is what type of element is your output guaranteed to be. And we can answer that question in more than one legitimate way. And so I'll give you two examples, and there are others as well. So first of all, whatever x is, as an appropriate input, when you take the square root of that number, that's always going to be a real number. So it is very reasonable to expect the outputs to be real numbers. Now, if we want, we can be a little bit more precise. Square root of x will actually always be a non-negative real number, and that is because when we take the square root of a number, using the square root function, there are two numbers that square to be x, but we choose the one that is non-negative. And that means, well, either the codomain can be the set of all real numbers if we want to be less precise, or if we want to be more precise, we can say that the codomain is the set of all non-negative real numbers. And of course, there are other sets are possible too. Those aren't the only two. So for the range, let's see. Well, the range, those are the actual outputs of our function. So the codomain tells us what type of outputs we get. The range tells us what the actual outputs are. And for that one, it is, so we're looking for the actual outputs of the function. And for that one, it is often helpful to look at the graph of the function f. So here's the graph of the function f as Desmos tells us. And remember, when we are graphing points, the x-coordinates of the points on the graph, those are the inputs of our function. The y-coordinates of the points on the graph, those are the outputs of the function. So if we're looking at the outputs of our function, that's just going to be the set of all the y-coordinates of points on the graph. And if you want to think about what those mean, well, the y-coordinates of the points on the graph, those are all the numbers on the y-axis that are across from the graph. Now, if you look at the graph, it appears to extend all the way up the y-axis starting at y equals 0, and notice that there are no points on the graph that are below the x-axis where y is negative, and that tells us that the range is the set of all non-negative real numbers. So now I think you're ready to start working on the activities. The name of the link on Blackboard is Domain, Codomain, Range, and that's a PDF file on that link that's included with this video.